Good morning, YouTubers. Today I'm going to discuss a short-lived but memorable NES accessory, the Power Glove. Many people growing up in the 1980s probably best remember this critical and commercial flop being associated with the fun, family-friendly 1989 movie, The Wizard.
We're too late. He touched my breast!
Can we show the other clip, please?
Jeez. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
But was it really that bad? The creators of the Power Glove were simply trying to bring virtual reality to the masses. Perhaps the masses weren't quite ready for this technology, or perhaps the technology itself wasn't quite ready for them. To understand what the Power Glove is and why it never really caught on, we have to go all the way back to 1950s Hollywood. Throughout the last half of the 20th century, virtual reality as a technology wasn't entirely a foreign concept. Morton Heilig was a Hollywood cinematographer who began developing what is arguably the earliest form of virtual reality in the form of his patented invention, the Sensorama, in the late 1950s. The concept behind the Sensorama involves giving an individual a multi-sensory experience that included 3D films. By 1964, the Sensorama was available to the public. However, due to the lack of financial backing, the Sensorama project had to be abandoned. Around the time the Sensorama project was abandoned, a recent MIT PhD grad named Ivan Sutherland published a paper where he envisioned what he would call a virtual reality head-mounted display. This device, in theory, would make non-existent items appear to be existing. In his paper, Sutherland discerned this virtual world as this. With appropriate programming, such a display could literally be the wonderland into which Alice walked. With the help of fellow student Bob Spruill, Sutherland began developing a head-mounted virtual reality display and actually had a working prototype by 1968. While the graphics the headset displayed were just simple wired frame rooms, the device was considered highly advanced for the time. Remember, in the 1960s, high-tech was considered stuff like this. The software Sutherland used displayed output in the stereoscopic display of the device. Other people such as Myron Kruger, Eric Howlett, and Michael Neymark all ultimately contributed to various aspects of what would be virtual reality technology, whether it be with the hardware or software eventually used. And honestly, the idea of someone experiencing a lifelike work of art can actually be traced back to the 18th century. Artists would paint massive panorama pieces stretching across a curved backdrop, in an attempt to allow the viewer to get a lifelike perspective of that event. In 1787, Robert Barker patented this panoramic technique, originally calling it nature at a glance, but in French, which I'm now about to attempt and butcher. Barker eventually displayed his panoramas in a custom-built gallery in Westminster. The idea behind it involved you standing on a platform and even skylight to view the panoramic paintings. While this two-dimensional art form is clearly not virtual reality as we know it, it's not too far off from the ridiculous, awesome-looking goggle contraption you're wearing. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1977, two researchers at the Electronic Visualization Laboratory at the University of Illinois at Chicago made the bold decision to act on an idea a fellow researcher named Richard Sayre had. Sayre's idea was to use a lightweight glove to monitor hand movements as an effective means for multi-dimensional control. Daniel Sandin and Thomas DeFanti created what they called the Sayre Glove in honor of their colleague. This marked the genesis of gesture recognition in the field of computer science. The Sayre Glove worked by using light sensors with flexible tubes. Placing the tip of the fingers attached to the tubes were photocells. As you bent the fingers, the amount of light that was transmitted through the tubes varied, but that variation as well allowed the photocells to know how much your finger flexed. However, virtual reality as a technology was still in its infancy. It was so early in its development that by the 1980s, the term virtual reality hadn't even been coined yet. In the early 1980s, Thomas Zimmerman was working at the Atari Research Center, and while sharing ideas with a co-worker in the music department named Jerome Lanier, Zimmerman realized that perhaps music would be the key to get this new technology off the ground. While making this video, I had the opportunity to speak with Thomas Zimmerman.
And as fate would have it, I took a course, and everyone had Apple IIs except the 6 of us had Ataris. And so one of the Atari people said, "Why don't you come to my Greenwich Village townhouse?" And because my husband knows how to program Atari computers. And that was a woman named Nancy Mayer. And so us six got together there, and I guess the tip-off should have been they had a townhouse in Greenwich Village. It turns out her husband was one of the 8 founders of Atari. And so at that point, as I mentioned, I fell in love with this ballet dancer. She got into the Oakland Ballet, so she moved to California and, you know, follow your passion. So I told Nancy, I'm going to move to California. And she said, well, why don't you talk to this group they're forming? There's a group of 3 engineers who are designing a sound chip. And from my experience of studying synthesizers and microprocessors, I got the job, and yeah, that changed my life.
In 1982, Zimmerman filed a patent for the Dataglove, a controller worn by the operator who would control various functions through the movements of their fingers and even whole hand. While similar to the Sayre glove, the technology was in fact very different. Zimmerman's idea used optical flex sensors instead of the light tubes used in the Sayre glove. Now, Zimmerman didn't actually file the patent under the Atari name, but that was only because they weren't interested in pursuing this type of technology at the time. It's reported that he did actually present the idea to Atari, and they did actually offer him $10,000 for it. But Zimmerman turned down the offer after a friend told him the idea was worth much more than that.
So my undergrad at MIT, I met a wonderful friend now, who's been my friend for 40 years, Sam Wantman. And he has a background in music and design, architecture, and education. So we were fantasizing about basically like air guitar and how you could conduct an orchestra with your hands. So this would be what we now call virtual orchestras. But he went off to Vermont and I went out to New York, so I started developing what became the Power Glove in my parents' home, and filed a patent on that before I moved out to California. So I had a patent on an instrumented glove. And so now I'm at Atari. Atari was mildly interested. They offered me $10,000 for it. And I thought, wow, it sounds like a lot of money in those days. So I consulted with a friend of mine in New York, and he said, this is going to be a lot bigger than $10,000, so don't take it. And that was very good advice. Anyway, so I had the glove, I had a patent on it, and I was at an electronic music concert at Stanford, and I met Sharon there. He was working at Atari too, but I don't recall ever meeting him at Atari, but perhaps that's how we knew each other. So at this electronic music concert, I told him about the glove I had, and he told me about a company he was starting to do programming by example, visual programming language he was developing. I think that my manager who offered that thought, oh, this is cute technology, let's just, I don't think he thought it through deeply. I think he just had money in his budget and it sounded like an interesting thing. And we were in it was Atari research lab, so they were always geared towards thinking about the future. So I think it was not a very deeply thought out offer. I think it was a flippant, like, oh, well, you know, I'll put this in my bag of tricks. So, yeah, I don't think it was very deeply thought out.
By 1983, the video game crash had caused Atari to lay off many of their staff, and with Zimmerman and Linear both on the chopping block, they decided to take that opportunity and form their own company, Visual Programming Language, or VPL. They immediately began developing this new virtual reality device based on the patent. The concept that makes the patent what it is involves a glove that transmits information and commands via the fingertips and sensors placed in the glove. Like I mentioned a few moments ago, Zimmerman's and Linear's device used an optical flex sensor mounted in the glove that detects movement whenever you bend your fingers. They dubbed their new device the Dataglove or wired glove. The sensors use light rays that reflect when the tube that contains the sensor is bent. When the light is reflected, it creates a signal that transmits from one end to another. Linear's contribution included designing and developing the ultrasonic and magnetic hand position technology that would ultimately be used in the Power Glove. An inventor named Young Harville modified the light rays that Zimmerman had originally developed and replaced them with optical flex sensors. This made the glove more precise in terms of detecting movement and position.
Young is a very talented jack of all trades, an artist, engineer. So we started VPL with this optical flex sensor. I mentioned the tube one, where you have LED on one side, photo transistor on the other. But there were at least two problems with it. One is it couldn't tell which way you were bending the tube. If you put the tube on a glove on your hand and you make a fist, great, you're bending it and measures that. But if you hyperextend your hand, which is you make it straight and then you make it beyond straight, so it curves the opposite way as closing, that's called hyperextension. It would think you're bending your fingers towards your fist. It couldn't tell the difference. And so that was really annoying, because on the screen, if you really wanted your hand open, you would tend to hyperextend your hand, but the glove would be reading it like your hand was closing. So it gives you the opposite visual feedback, which was really annoying. And the other one is it was kind of bulky, because the tube is, let's say, 1/4 of an inch. And so if you pushed your hand against something, you'd compress the tube and change the readings. And so what Young did was he developed a different mechanism, a different flex sensor, very clever. And what it uses is fiber optics. Now, fiber optics, when you bend them, they're supposed to not, the light goes through fiber optics if you bend them or keep them straight. That's what fiber optics do. He actually scratched the surface of the fiber optics right where your joint is that you want to measure. And so as you bend it, it becomes very lossy, which is the opposite of what you want for fiber optics, but it's exactly what you want for a flex sensor. And that was great on several levels. One, it was more precise than the tube method. And you could localize the bending sensing. So as the fiber passed a lower joint, which you don't want to measure, it wouldn't care if it was bending or not there, and you would just scratch where you want it to be sensitive. And the third factor was, it turns out by doing that, you could have a Dataglove with no electricity on your hand, because you could have the fibers, let's say, a few meters long, and put all the electronics, the LEDs and the photo transistors, in a box, and just have fibers coming to your hand, which was really good for medical applications where you don't want electricity on the hand. So yes, long story short, he developed a superior flex sensor, and that's what we used on the high-end Dataglove.
Numerous industries became interested in the potential this new wire glove technology provided, including those in the medical field, the music industry, and even NASA.
We made a good business selling the Dataglove. Let me distinguish. We had two gloves, basically. We had the high-end Dataglove, which we sold for $8,000. And then we had a low-end power glove, which Mattel sold for $80. And one of the things we had to explain often is, how come this Dataglove cost $8,000 and this power glove cost $80? So that's 2 orders of magnitude. The Dataglove was much more, it was a scientific instrument with much higher performance and uses magnetic tracking, a very sophisticated tracking to get the hand position and orientation. We sold a lot of them to research institutes and like NASA, and actually, ironically, we sold one to IBM Almaden Research Center, which is where I work now.
The whole idea of this wired glove revolved around using the glove to input information into the computer instead of a keyboard or mouse. In the 1980s, there was a lot of interest in developing different methods to interact with your computer or game console. Nintendo even tried early on with the release of the Power Pad. This was an attempt to make video games more physical rather than just sitting on your couch with a joystick or controller. The idea made health-conscious parents happy, yet ultimately the Power Pad failed. This is probably due to how unadvanced computer software was to accommodate the user. The games developed for the Power Pad were pretty basic, especially compared to the ones the Wii or the Xbox series of consoles use. But the gaming industry wasn't the only field interested in controlling objects through gesture recognition. Both the medical field and NASA were interested in using this technology, and Zimmerman's company began catering to these fields. The Dataglove that Zimmerman marketed to NASA and surgeons rang up at $8,000 apiece. However, it was a highly advanced piece of technology that was quite efficient and accurate. The glove achieved this accuracy by using 2 fiber optic loops on each finger of the neoprene fabric device. Each loop was dedicated to a corresponding knuckle. An LED at the end of each loop corresponded with a photosensor at the other end. When you bent a finger, light would escape through small cuts that were placed along the fiber optic cable. The photosensor measured the amount of light that traveled through the cuts, using that information to determine which position the finger was in at any given time. While this was impressive for the era, one of the major drawbacks was the glove required frequent recalibration, sometimes even during the same session with the same user. But when it was properly calibrated, it worked amazingly well. Like many technologies, Zimmerman licensed out his patent to other companies interested in gesture-based devices. One such company became interested not in developing a device for doctors and scientists, but instead creating a toy that would become an obsession and passion for a trio of brothers. Abrams Gentile Entertainment, also known as AGE, was started by Marty Abrams, Christopher Gentile, and Christopher's younger twin brothers, John and Anthony. Marty Abrams was the son of David and Madeline Abrams, who started the Mego Corporation in 1954. Mego was a toy company that actually went bankrupt in 1982. When AGE was formed just 4 years later, they acquired all of Mego's licensing contracts, which included toys based on popular films and television shows of the 1960s and 70s, as well as comic book heroes. AGE's first client hired them to create the official poster for the movie Rambo, First Blood Part 2. This movie was about soldier John Rambo rescuing POWs in Vietnam and apparently destroying his boss's office. I'm pretty sure human resources would frown at this. After successfully finishing the project, AGE became inspired to create a line of toys based on the Rambo movies. This was a major gamble, considering Rambo is your stereotypical 80s action film that wasn't even targeted to young children. Other toy lines based on adult action films typically failed, such as the Alien film, although these days those toys are highly sought after by collectors. Despite these risks, AGE obtained a license to manufacture the Rambo toy line, and unlike the aforementioned toy lines, they were successful. So successful, in fact, that they continued developing and manufacturing toys.
Mission accomplished.
But Christopher Gentile had higher expectations for what AGE could become. The elder Gentile brother graduated from Syracuse in 1981 with a degree in engineering and computer science. Before joining his brothers to form AGE, Gentile worked as a nuclear engineer. It was this background and thinking that caused him to convince his younger brothers and Abrams to focus on the gaming industry, an industry whose future was still uncertain following the video game crash of 1983. Gentile saw Zimmerman's Dataglove as the technology needed to push the gaming industry back into homes again. Originally wanting AGE to develop their own gaming system to rival that of Nintendo, Gentile was unable to persuade investors or toy makers into getting into the ring with the recently successful NES console. Gentile then realized, if you can't beat them, join them. Acquiring a license from Zimmerman to develop a Dataglove product for use on the Nintendo was easy, but getting a license from Nintendo itself would be a different story. But even more challenging was taking an $8,000 device that ran on software costing hundreds of thousands of dollars and converting it into a marketable, cost-efficient product for consumers' homes. By this point, AGE had working relationships with several toy manufacturers, including Mattel, whom they had helped with their line of talking Barbies. But approaching Mattel with the idea of a product for the video game industry was like walking in with a hand grenade. In 1979, Mattel attempted to compete with Atari after releasing a series of Intellivision game consoles. I'm not getting into details here about the Intellivision, that's actually for a standalone video soon. All you need to know now is that the Intellivision became a victim of the video game crash of 1983, losing over $300 million for Mattel and forcing them to lay off 2/3 of their electronics staff. After that happened, they vowed to never get back into the video game industry. Realizing the thin ice they were walking on, Gentile approached Mattel VPL co-founder Jerome Lanier, hooking up their Dataglove system to a Commodore 64 for a demonstration. Using an Apple Macintosh to communicate with the NES console, Gentile and Lanier demonstrated several games using the Dataglove as a controller. It wasn't until they invited Mattel CEO Joe Barad up to try the Dataglove with Mike Tyson's Punch-Out that the meeting took a turning point. After knocking out the first opponent of the game with one punch, she removed the glove and simply stated,
"I want to do this."
Most of the Mattel board was skeptical, but Barad's enthusiasm was what secured the deal for AGE and VPL. At that point, Gentile realized exactly the challenge it would be to take an $8,000 piece of complicated machinery and converting it into a marketable product that cost only $26 to make. In November of 1988, both companies got to work. The first thing that needed adapting were the fiber optics that actually transmitted the information from one end of the glove to the other. They settled on using flexible ink embedded on mylar sheets, which only cost 5 cents to produce. This was considered the best, cheapest alternative in making a flexible sensor. This conductive ink was originally intended to be used in the building of flexible circuit boards. This ink didn't actually work well in the practice of building flexible circuit boards, mainly because its conductive properties changed after bending. Ironically, this problem of the ink's conductive properties changing during movement was exactly what Gentile was looking for, in terms of an inexpensive way of calculating movement in the Power Glove. And the final product, 2 layers of this ink would be used to serve as a sensor. According to a December 4th, 1989 article in Design News, a publication aimed at design engineers, the Power Glove sensor worked by using a slightly curved, manta ray-shaped component above the knuckles holding the sensors.
Yeah, actually my original patent was on a sensor which used tubes, used LEDs and phototransistors in a shiny tube, and the light would shine off the walls of the tube, and as you bent it, less light would get to the phototransistor. That was the first sensor for the Power Glove, Dataglove series. But then when Mattel got hold of it through our license with us, they moved to a different sensor to make it more manufacturable, basically silk screening carbon goo onto plastic to make a flex sensor.
To help mesh all these components together and design the Power Glove, Mattel hired Image Design and Marketing. They had just recently finished designing the futuristic sets that would be used in the film Robocop 2. According to Gary Yamron, a partner with Image Design and Marketing, they actually designed the first Power Glove prototype only 6 days after conception. Using AutoCAD Release 10 engineering software from Autodesk, a 3D design was developed, and during that process, a number of factors were taken into consideration for the design. First and foremost, no left-handed glove was ever produced by Mattel or AGE. If someone comes up to you and shows you a left-handed Power Glove, it's a homemade hack. The reason for only making right-handed gloves was simply because only 10% of the population was left-handed. With that same rationale in mind, the glove size was intended to fit most kids aged 9 years old to 14 years old. To accommodate various hand sizes, the fingertips and palm were left open, while the remaining material that surrounded the user's hand was made from a stretched material. Weight was also a major factor. The final product needed to be lightweight, yet resistant to reasonable damage. Hal Berger, a co-owner of Image Design and Marketing, stated that their biggest challenge was actually developing a design that housed both the sensors and pre-existing components, while maintaining this lightweight end product. Developing a new library of games and making it backwards compatible with the already existent library games proved to be another challenge. Developing a game intended for the Power Glove became a living contradiction. How do you develop a game for a device that technically doesn't exist yet? And how do you create a device for a game that doesn't exist yet either? An engineer at Mattel named Will Novak was tasked with answering the former question. One of the quintessential aspects of the Power Glove was calibrating it in tune with the sensors, which you'd attach to the top of your television. The setup included 3 sensors that required calibration in order for the console to know the glove's location, which worked by using an ultrasonic triangulation sound message that got sent to the sensors. When set up properly and calibrated correctly, the glove reportedly worked quite nicely. However, one of the major hurdles involved relying on kids to properly calibrate them frequently. One of the problems that also occurred were kids inputting the wrong game code before calibration. While just developing the Power Glove to be compatible with NES games proved challenging enough, one of the final hurdles AGE and Mattel both faced would be convincing Nintendo to finally license the product. Numerous times in previous episodes, I've already covered in detail Nintendo's strict licensing agreements. Despite this uphill battle with Nintendo's licensing, Mattel and AGE were successful at convincing Nintendo to officially license their product. Considering that around that same time, Nintendo was also licensing the U-Force from Broderbond, they probably saw both the Power Glove and U-Force as investments that even if they failed, wouldn't damage Nintendo's reputation. After all, they sold over 7 million NES consoles in 1989 alone. It would take more than some futuristic-looking devices to take Nintendo down a peg or two. At the 1989 Consumer Electronics Show in June, AGE introduced the Power Glove to retailers for the 1989 Christmas season. Even though Mattel was distributing the Power Glove, they were hesitant to put their name on the booth at CES. AGE took 700,000 orders from retailers such as Walmart and Toys R Us. Mattel spent little effort on developing games for the Power Glove, instead focusing on just getting the hardware to market. Like I mentioned earlier, they were able to include it in the 1989 movie The Wizard. In late 1989, the Power Glove received a lot of hyper-promotion through the media. This was the it item on kids' Christmas wish lists. For the manufacturing and distribution in Japan, Nintendo licensed packs to tackle that market with the same product. By the end of 1989, it seemed like the future of gaming was going to change forever. But what was optimism at the end of one decade soon turned to pessimism not long after the start of the next one. The Power Glove was released with a $75 price tag. Adjusted for inflation in 2018, that's about $150. In some areas where demand was higher, the price rose to about $150 in 1989 dollars. One of the major downsides that began to show soon after its release was the lack of being Power Glove specific games. The only two games released specifically for the Power Glove were Super Glove Ball and Bad Street Brawler. Bad Street Brawler was simply a beat-em-up game that had previously already been ported over to the Commodore 64 and the Amiga. At the time of the Power Glove's release in late 1989, Mattel was still working on what would be the only Power Glove design game, Super Glove Ball, which was a puzzle-like game that actually performed well with the Power Glove. But that's really the only game that did perform well with it. By the time Super Glove Ball was released in late 1990, Mattel decided to discontinue the Power Glove completely. With the Power Glove only being on the market for a year, on top of consumer dissatisfaction, it would seem clear as to why it was considered a failure. But was it really? To truly answer that, we have to also take a look at the numbers. By the time the Power Glove was discontinued in late 1990, Mattel had sold over 1.3 million units, grossing about $88 million. To adjust for inflation in 2018, just double that number. Of the 1.3 million Power Gloves sold, 600,000 were in Japan, despite having no games released specifically for it there. One of the reasons Mattel considered the Power Glove to be a flop was because they had actually projected $120 million in sales, so it came in considerably under their projections. That, combined with the criticism and reputation the Power Glove was receiving by the end of 1990, caused Mattel to discontinue the product entirely. In 1996, Chris Gentile left AGE, the company he had helped create, and by 1997, he started MC2 Incorporated, which focuses on state-of-the-art technologies and content for the entertainment industry. Gentile is still with MC2 and currently serves as their president and CEO. In 2008, he also started a new company called iBoard Incorporated, which serves as a technology development and production house, where he also serves as its president and CEO. In August of 2017, Gentile authored an article introducing the Air Power Glove, which he claims will be the next generation of video game glove controllers. This new device will reportedly use Bluetooth technology to connect with multiple devices, such as your TV and even a drone. Twin brothers John and Anthony Gentile went on to work as writers and producers of various television series, as well as co-founded T-Ink Incorporated in 2000, a company that specializes in developing high-tech conductive inks. One of their patents is something called touch code, which is invisible electronic code printed on paper, cardboard, or even film that can be read by the right electronic device. In 1990, BPL Research filed for bankruptcy, but in 1999, Sun Microsystems purchased their patents for the virtual reality and graphics products. Drone Linear went on to work for Internet2, a nonprofit consortium that furnishes the network backbone of more than 200 educational institutions, governments, corporations, and other nonprofits like themselves. In 2006, Linear began working for Microsoft, and just 3 years later, started working at Microsoft Research as an interdisciplinary scientist. Microsoft Research employs more than 1,000 researchers in the fields of computer science, physics, and engineering, just to name a few. Linear still works as both a musician and an activist in a number of different fields. A few years after VPL's bankruptcy, Thomas Zimmerman went on to work for IBM, where he still works today and has over 50 patents to his name. These days, he has a real passion for STEM programs, as well as STEAM programs.
You've heard of STEAM, which is Science, Technology, Engineering, Art, and Math, because STEM is great for people who are already interested in technology. What I find exciting is to use art as a way to get kids who aren't interested necessarily in science and technology to get involved in building stuff. So, yeah, I think that the STEM and STEAM movement across the country is wonderful. What really makes America great is innovation, and it's really important for us to keep that happening. And so I think it's great that kids are getting involved in building stuff.
It's been almost 30 years since the Power Glove was released to the public. At the time, this was touted as the next generation of controllers, not just for video games, but for everything. Currently, virtual reality technology is making a comeback in both interest and advancement. In that regard, was the Power Glove a failed product? Depends on how you look at it. When it came to marketing, I gotta give it an A. They hyped this thing in all the right media. Various news outlets covered it during the holiday season, not to mention it was featured in a major motion picture released during that same holiday season. They successfully got the word out. In terms of finance, I also gotta give it an A. AGE and Mattel took an $8,000 piece of technology and converted it into a $75 product that cost only $26 to manufacture. Plus, while Mattel did fall short of its own $120 million projection expectation, it did pull in over $80 million in sales. I think most companies would call that a successful product. Now, it did have some flaws, most notably with the lack of specific games designed for it. That, on top of the backwards compatibility being lackluster, gives it an F. 2 A's and an F. Not the best report card, but not the worst. I also think it influenced many of the wireless controllers and devices we currently use, such as Bluetooth technology.
Well, clearly it was responsible for virtual reality 1.0 back 35 years ago. And now it's fun to see the next generation rediscovering virtual reality. Most people are still using, little plastic box with switches as the interface. But I bet some people will start finding the value of actually instrumenting your hand. Because what I found was the same way we manipulate the physical world with our hand, the virtual hand becomes a very appropriate tool for manipulating the virtual world. So I think introducing this whole idea of computer synthetic worlds, virtual worlds, and then combining it with the real world, what's called augmented reality, can be very powerful because it puts us at the center of control, which is where humans always want to be. And at the end of the day, what's most important is the human, is where I always come back to.
Many people have their various opinions about the Power Glove, but I think the movie The Wizard best sums up what I think is the best overall memory of the Power Glove.
He touched my breast!
Will somebody please play the right clip for once?
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Well, that is it for this episode of The Bearded Nerd. Be sure to click the thumbs up if you like this video, and to subscribe if you want to keep up with future videos. See you next time.
OCP is proud to present the future of urban pacification. Robocop 2. $19 million.